Discover prototypical track and turnouts with the Roadmaster series from Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply. Proudly made in the United States, Oak Hill's handcrafted turnouts provide unparalleled detail and accuracy, giving your layout museum-quality track work at an affordable price. Whether fully built or in easy-to-assemble kit form, Roadmaster provides all the details of real track. Looking for a custom piece of track work? Oak Hill can help with custom turnouts, diamonds, crossings, and more. Check out all of their offerings on their website, ohrtracksupply.com. If you're looking to bring more realism to your layout industries, look no further than tullymodels.com, the home of Southern Tier Grain Modeler Supply and Steel Mill Modeler Supply. With models to fit steam, transition, and diesel eras, Kevin Tully has you covered with all of the components you'll need to take your grain and steel mills to the next level. Check out the entire catalog at tullymodels.com. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com.
ATLP Rewind.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me today, coming to us from just outside of Portland, Oregon, Brian Sopke. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Boy, I'm excited to talk to yet another freelancer that our good friend Chris Palmieri connected me with. So I love freelancers. I love hearing the stories and how this all got developed, because I think a part of me wants to be a freelancer too, because I think it's a lot of fun and being able to create your own story and the challenges that you get to do, creating logos and all that. I certainly think it'd be something that's super enjoyable. So glad to have you here and glad we're finally able to get your story.
Well, freelancing is a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, that's for sure. I can see that. And I can also see that you've really enjoyed with the projects with Mr. Palmieri and home shops. You have yourself a car in the Rapido PCNF 5258 boxcar run. Tell us a bit about that and how that project came to fruition.
Got to know Chris through a mutual friend, and his Arkansas Valley layout was featured in the very first run of Home Shops cars, and which we'll get into later. There's ties between the Arkansas Valley and my Benton and Southern. But as soon as I saw what Home Shops was doing and saw the first batch of cars for the 4750 covered hoppers from Tangent that Home Shops did, I was hooked and knew that I wanted to eventually have a Benton Southern car in some form or another. And it took a little while to get the artwork figured out and get what car type we're going to do. Because I only have because of my limited space, I don't have a lot of variety of industries. So I wanted to make sure it was a car that I could support more than just a couple cars of, and worked with Chris, designed the logo. We had Matt from Circus City kind of finalize the artwork, and one thing led to another, and here came the boxcars.
Oh, that's awesome. It sounds like a real fun project to work with Chris. And you said Matt Welke over at Circus City is a great graphic designer, and
fantastic.
And yeah, he's got great product in itself with Circus City and their decals. And yeah, it's sounds like a lot of fun to be able to get work in that creative space with probably one of the best minds in freelance model railroading, that being Chris. I mean, just a joy to listen to him talk freelance, and you know, the stuff that he's come up with the Meridian Speedway is always a joy to hear about. And you know, now you're connected with him through this project, which is really cool.
And he's so passionate about it, about freelancing and model railroading, and Chris was super easy to work with, and Matt Welke was great to work with. Making revisions as needed. It was a very smooth process, and it really, for the amount of work that went into it, it went fairly quickly. Thankfully, I have a little bit of graphics background from doing professional photography years ago. I learned Photoshop and the different products associated with it. And so I had some of the rough artwork done, and then I was able to hand that over to them, and they were able to create the final vector artwork that was needed for Rapido.
Awesome stuff. It's a car that pops for sure, and still available on Home Shop's website. We'll provide the links in the show notes and also on the episodes page on aroundthelayout.com to be able to go there and get your car ordered. But before we get to learning about the Benton and Southern, I want to learn a bit more about you and how you got started in this hobby. So tell us about that.
Well, born and raised Portland, Oregon. Lived basically in this area except for about 3 years of my life. I'm almost 50 now. Got started with railroading. My dad took me down to the Union Pacific train yard when I was little and let me sit and watch the switch engines sorting cars, and the diesel facilities were right there, easy access, so I could see all of the different locomotives and whatnot, and I was hooked. My parents gave me a Silver Streak Tyco train set when I think for Christmas when I was like 2. And aside from a gap during high school when I was more interested in girls and other things, I've been doing model railroading my whole life. Got serious about it in my early 20s and have been doing it ever since.
What were you doing in your mid-20s with model railroading?
I got back into the hobby through a now late friend of mine. I was working at a hardware store, and he would come in and buy little 256 screws for his model train couplers. And I'd always appreciated trains, and we would talk, and he invited me to come see his layout, and he had a informal club, if you will, that ran every Thursday night on his layout. And there were about 7 or 8 guys. And I came over, got to check it out. They all liked me. Not sure why, but they all liked me and let me become a member of the group, and spent several years doing that.
What was his layout like? What was he modeling?
He was a hill lines modeler, Great Northern, Northern Pacific, SP&S. His layout was essentially a glorified loop. He had his entire attic of his house divided off into 2 sections. And so you had the north side and the south side, and it was all DC. So you actually had to kind of speed match the throttles between the 2 sides, and communication was via couple of light bulbs, a green, yellow, and red light bulb that were mounted above the door between the 2 sides. The green you could send your train through, and it just basically ran in circles. We had a couple of yard operators. It was very informal. We had a club member that loved to send out the green train and then the blue train. And by that, he would take take like Burlington Northern locomotives, find any green colored car and send it down the main line. And he was as far from a prototype modeler as you could get. He did it more to irk the couple of the guys that were like the rivet counters in the group.
Oh,
and he did it just to be silly. And we had so much fun with it.
Yeah, a little introduction, slight into operations, but got you into it. And it's kind of a neat concept that he had, call it kind of like a club, but it was really his private layout.
It was.
Again, remind me, if you didn't tell me already, how big was the layout?
Oh, geez. It was his entire attic. I would say 20 by 50.
Wow. Yeah. So big area. That was pretty cool to see.
Yeah.
So in the mid-20s, you're involved with him. And then what did you start to do something on your own?
And, I started building Athearn kits and learning about that, upgrading power to Atlas and Kato engines, because they ran so much better. I had a little layout at home. It wasn't much of anything because I was living with my folks. When I moved out on my own, I didn't really have a lot of room because I was in a small apartment. I joined a large club in the Portland area called the Columbia Gorge Model Railroad Club. That was fun, but they were very politicky, and as a lot large clubs get that way. So nothing against the club. I always had a good time, but kind of went off and did my own thing.
Yeah, I think that's a familiar experience with some clubs, and I think sometimes, hey, I'm a fan of democracy, but democracy doesn't always work in all situations, and clubs can kind of be that way, where it's you've got a multitude of different opinions and styles and everything coming to a clash in a club, and
hard to get anything done.
Yeah. So they're hard. They're I'm sure difficult roads to manage. I was a member of a club for a very short period of time, and I experienced just that. But I mean, there were still takeaways, and I'm sure you had plenty of takeaways from that club as well. Tell us a bit about it.
I learned a lot. I learned about how to maintain track, and I learned a little bit about scenery that, a lot of the guys didn't want to share the secrets. They just kind of wanted to do it. But that's okay. I learned about, different car types and what they hauled. I was really naive when I was younger.
Yeah.
But once I got it figured out, then the more I did, the more I got interested in switching. And I liked working in the yard because I could switch cars back and forth and sort them. And, that was kind of my first real foray into operations. And the club was a show club. They had an open house every November where they'd have thousands of people come through, and it was just running a double track main line in loop form.
Yeah.
But I really got more into operations once I started doing my own thing. I met a couple of friends when I was living up in Olympia, Washington. They had more operations-based layouts. One of them was an N-scale layout called the Mudband Southern, which is an amazing railroad. And then I got to know Tyler Whitcomb. You've probably seen his freelance Tenino Western in the Railroad Press. Gained to know them, learning more about the operations and more following the prototype procedures and learning using car cards and waybills or switch lists. It really made it a lot more fun for me.
How'd you get to meet them?
Tyler, I met through Jim Yonkins, who owns the Mudband Southern. I met Jim through the Olympia Model Railroad Round Robin group. I'll be honest with you, I don't even, it's far enough back, I don't remember exactly who it was that introduced us. But I spent many operating sessions running trains for Jim. After I moved back to Oregon, we actually set up a remote dispatching using Skype. And I dispatched an operating session for him from my home in Portland. Well, the layout was being operated up in his basement in Olympia.
I always ask that question, why, when people mention other people, like, how did you meet? Because it fascinates me how many people you meet through this hobby, and then the different channels that you get to meet them in, whether it be a hobby shop or a club or whoever, a friend of a friend, and how well this hobby can network always fascinates me. And it sounds like it's done the same thing for you, regardless of where you've been.
Yes, that's absolutely. Yeah. I've considered myself very blessed to have met model railroaders all over the country, even more so now with the benefits of social media. I've always, when I go travel, I try and meet people that are in the hobby. I'll get on Facebook groups, the operating groups, and ask, hey, who's a local operator out this way, or see if I can get it in to see somebody's layout. Thomas Klomoski extended the invitation for me to come see his Georgia Northeastern Railroad. Unfortunately, time didn't allow it. He was just a little too far from the direction I was headed. So, but maybe that'll happen next time I make it down there.
Yeah, it's definitely neat when you're able to do that, travel pretty much anywhere and be able to find model railroaders, which also opens the question for me: how many more model railroaders are out there that we don't even know about? And it just fascinates me to drive through a neighborhood and where are these layouts hidden that they haven't come out yet and waved their hand and said, hi, I'm a model railroader.
Yeah. I spent 11 years working at Whistle Stop Trains in Portland, Oregon. It's one of the two big shops in Portland. And I got to meet the benefit of that is I got to meet all the local guys, and I've gotten to operate on several of their layouts, discussed different techniques, learned about weathering and how to do it. And, as I've gotten better, I've actually given a couple of clinics on weathering, which was kind of fun. I never thought I would do that.
I think the hobby shop was the original Facebook group, wasn't it? I mean,
it really was.
Yeah. Like, so how'd you get involved with Whistle Stop and working for them?
It's a shop I'd been going to since I was a kid. I worked for Charlie, the owner, one summer out of high school, basically sweeping the floors, cleaning the shelves, organizing, straightening things up. And I was between jobs when I had moved back from a short stay in Colorado where I was working for the railroad. And I ended up going in and asked him, hey, you got any part-time work that I could do for you? Sorting shelves or cleaning the cabinets or whatever. And he put me to work, and it turned into a full-time job. And I ended up working full-time for him for close to 11 years.
Wow. So that's a long time in a hobby shop. Tell us about that, because it seems like maybe some people look at it as like every person's dream, every model railroader's dream to work in a hobby shop, but surrounded by it as a full-time job. How did you manage that and keep interest? And more importantly, how did you not turn the paycheck back over to them every week with keeping?
That was probably the hardest part of it. Yeah. The advantages of working in the hobby shop is you really kind of have your thumb on the pulse of what's going on in the hobby. You're seeing all the announcements as they come out, getting to see the product when it first comes on, new hits the shelf before it actually goes on the shelf and is sold. And, I came in a week later. I come in once a week now, and I'm sure I miss stuff, but it's hard to not get burned out at times. There are days I'd come home and want nothing to do with trains. And I'd say 99% of the customers were absolutely fantastic. That 1% you dread when they come in. It's retail.
It's 1% in any industry, it seems. There's always a 1%. Yeah,
absolutely. And it was fun. I met my friend Joe, who owns the Arkansas Valley. He's a local truck driver who's originally from the New Orleans area, who grew up. It was in the same model railroad club as Chris Palmieri and his dad. So, there's that whole tie there. And that's how I ended up getting to meet Chris and home shops and all of that.
What's the joke they say with the thing they say about Kevin
7 degrees of separation? Yeah.
7 degrees of separation, right? But I think model railroading, it's far less than 7 degrees. I think it's like 4. Like if you start talking to somebody, it's like, but before you know it, you found somebody in common that or have met or whatnot. I think it's definitely a lot less than 7 degrees, but always neat to hear those connections that you were talking about.
Well, yeah, it's crazy how that works. Meeting Joe Loggins was through the hobby shop. He was a regular customer, always coming in talking about his freelance model railroad, and I'd gotten interested in freelancing early on, but I always modeled Pacific Northwest short lines. I liked the short line scene. I was not interested in modeling the UP or the SP, even though the SP was my favorite prototype road. I knew I was never going to have a giant basement the odds were slim, and to be able to model a class 1 railroad faithfully. That's where the short lines, got me interested. A friend of mine in the Portland area owned a short line, and I learned how to run a locomotive and actually volunteered for him for over several years.
Wow.
They had a tourist operation they ran. I was a conductor for that. I'd help him after the passenger trains were done for the day, run the freight if it needed to go out that night, and if there's a hot car. And I got really interested in the short lines doing through that. And I liked the switching, so a switching style layout made the most sense. That's what I've had the room to do. So I always has been in a small bedroom, 2x8, 2x12, 2x whatever. And I modeled Pacific Northwest because that's where I'm from. I was getting bored with it and wanted to do something different. And I was kind of lamenting this as I was talking with Joe and a couple of the other folks in the hobby shop. We were talking about what we model and whatnot. And I said I wanted to do something different. I'd like to interchange with you, Joe, but yours is the Arkansas Valley. You're in Arkansas. It's kind of hard to do that from the Pacific Northwest. What can we do about that? And we started talking. He asked me what I knew about the Rock Island Railroad. And I said it was a Midwest railroad that went bankrupt in 1980 and disappeared. And that was literally all I knew about it. And he started talking a little bit about the Rock Island operations in Arkansas. And it got me curious. So I went home that night and over the course of the next several days, spent a lot of time on the internet researching the Rock Island. Found it completely fascinating. Joe and I talked, and he and I created the Benton and Southern. Benton and Southern, BNS, is my initials. That's I wanted to do that. It made sense. Benton, Arkansas was just south of Little Rock, and started a basic backstory, and then I've since over the last couple of years gone back and really refined that backstory to it starting from a 20-mile short line that took over off an old Mopac branch down in Arkansas because Mopac didn't want it. They wanted to abandon it, but the shippers banded together and created this short line. And from there, it grew. When the Rock Island went bankrupt, instead of all of that track south of Little Rock being abandoned, or most of it being abandoned, the Benton and Southern stepped in and says, you know what, we'll operate it. And we kind of took over that, and it kind of spiraled from there.
Oh, that's interesting. Have you ever been to that area? Have you ever done a site visit to Arkansas and seen this, or is this something that you learned through research?
Learned through research. Haven't made it there yet. The closest I've made it to is Ruston, Louisiana, which is due south of Little Rock. It's part of that old Rock Island trackage. So I actually stood on the old Rock Island tracks right where it crosses the now KCS Meridian Speedway. It was originally Illinois Central at the time. Mm-hmm. And I stood right there where the diamond was. And that was kind of cool to be able to say I've been to that place now. I definitely want to get up back down there again and go see Little Rock and Fort Smith and Clarksville, which is the town that I model. Clarksville did have rail service off of a little Mopac branch, but passenger service ended in the 60s, and the railroad pulled out completely in the late 80s. The story behind how the Benton and Southern ended up in there was it was an Arkansas Valley branch that it was called part of their Clinton branch. It went from a connection with their main line at a little place called Ork, which is kind of in the foothills of the Ozarks. And it went east through Clarksville and into Clinton, Arkansas, where it connected with the Crescent City Model Railroad Club out of New Orleans, their freelance main line going the Crescent lines. And the story went cut back, and AV wasn't interchanging much traffic. Business was down. They wanted to be rid of it. So through a couple of different transactions, Benton and Southern ended up taking over that branch line. And yeah.
Talk about your research on this, because you talk about some of the real prototype ties with how Rock Island and the Mopac and all that. Talk about where you were learning this stuff from to try to help in a sense build your freelance story.
Google was my friend. I found a couple of Rock Island Facebook groups. Chris's dad has a page on Facebook called Mike's Mostly Louisiana Railroads. I joined that group and have just, posted pictures and posed questions. And I ended up actually communicating with a guy named, I want to say his name was Jack Fuller. He was the general manager of the semi-quasi independent Little Rock, which was the Rock Island from Little Rock in Arkansas, basically south into Louisiana, basically the branch lines that I took over. And he was the general manager of that, or president of that section of railroad in the late 70s when they tried to change it into a wholly owned independent subsidiary, if you will. They had their own marketing, they had their own salespeople, management. They shared power with the Rock Island. They shared, a lot of the upper management, legal, and all of that. But they operated as an independent railroad. They had they kept their own books, and they were actually turning a profit while the rest of the Rock Island was continuing to fail.
Wow.
So he provided me with an absolute wealth of information.
I'd say you lucked into meeting a great person to give you all that knowledge, because you seem very knowledgeable about how that happened, and I can only imagine that just again fuels that freelance story.
Yeah, it did. It helped. He provided me with documentation showing these are the trains we ran. This is how much power they required. This is what time the crews went on duty, what days they worked and had off. And I mean, it was just a wealth of documentation. He sent me track charts, and it just was almost information overload. It took me quite a while to digest it all. And then as far as the Clinton branch where I modeled, that was more learning, developing the backstory with Joe, just through lots of communication and Google Maps, and figuring out, okay, this is where the tracks would have gone, that kind of thing.
You mentioned Joe and the Arkansas Valley being very influential to you as you're developing your freelance story. Was there any other influences in freelance or freelance railroads that were on your radar that were, helping or at least inspiring you to create this story?
Probably my earliest inspirations were Alan McClellan and the VNO, Tony Custer's Allegheny Midland. More recent years, the Utah Belt, Mike Confalone's Allagash.
Yeah, another great one. Yeah, all layouts, and I keep going back to it. I think the mark of success for a freelance model railroader is to have somebody Google your railroad thinking it's real, right? I think it seems like either a goal or a great side effect of freelancing is for somebody to go, oh, you mean that's not real? Because many of the ones you mentioned are ones that I personally had looked up and said, oh, it's got to be a real railroad somewhere, right? And they were not.
That's funny you mentioned that. Probably 20 years ago when I was living up in Olympia, my ex-wife was a graphic designer, and she helped me design a website for my freelance railroad at the time. I called it the Black Lake Southern. And we created a website, used a prototype photo that was photoshopped, and I just had the website set up to look like it was for a real railroad. And I actually received a couple of emails asking if we were hiring.
Oh, that's amazing. So I'm also catching in this that the Benton and Southern is not your first take in a freelance railroad. Tell me about this first one you had.
It was the Black Lake Southern was set in the Olympia area. It was just another short line that I came up with off the cuff. It never really got very far as the backstory or any of that. It was more just, I liked Jim Youngkin's Mud Band Southern, so I wanted to freelance like he does. And so that's what I did. I created a paint scheme. There was no logo or anything like that, really. It was just, it wasn't that well thought out.
Well, at least in 2, I'm noticing a theme of B and S in the names of everything. I think that there's no coincidence there, is there?
No. And all the guys at the hobby shop tease me and call my railroad the BS line. So,
well, between your initials and what BS stands for, and it's just kind of funny. But that's great that again diving into this freelance idea, and then you had a take on it with your first, and now really developing the story, and then the tie-in, with the Arkansas Valley, and that must have been a lot of fun. It sounds like Joe's become a good friend of yours, and to be able to tie your railroads together must be something really special.
It is. It's a lot of fun. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking on the phone, texting, sending back and forth ideas. I mean, if I were to put all of that stuff into print form, it'd be a book on all the well, what if we did this? Or, I like your idea, but what do you think if we were to change it just this much to say, okay, instead of having it happen in 1984, we had it do it in 81, and this is why, and we've just kind of gone back and forth. And, Joe, when he created his Arkansas Valley, never really thought too much about branch lines. And I told him that I wanted to model. At one point, I was going to do the Benton and Southern, and then I said to him, you know what? I've got a bunch of Arkansas Valley motive power that Joe had given me, and I was like, well, what if I were to model a section of the Arkansas Valley? And that kind of blew his mind. And so we started talking about it. I said, what about a branch line? Did the AV have any branch lines? And he came up with the concept for the Clinton branch. And originally it started as the Hector branch, which was about halfway down the branch. And then through discussions and metamorphosis, it ended up extending down to Clinton to connect with the crescent lines. And then it got cut back to Hector again, and then it got put back to Clinton. And we kind of went back and forth and really tried to figure out exactly how we were going to do it. And he had not really given much thought to branch lines. So this has been, it kind of rekindled his excitement about the AV. It's because he's coming at it now, looking at it in a whole new direction.
Yeah. And it sounds like, he was willing to help, modify his story to help accommodate what you were looking to do as well. He wasn't steadfast and say no. He wanted to make this happen.
Yeah, he's been a big help. He was, he said he was flattered to have somebody want to model his freelance railroad. And so I was originally going to do the Hector branch of the Arkansas Valley. But then I was like, I kind of want my Benton and Southern back. And I'm like, okay, how can we bring the Benton and Southern to the Clinton branch? So we went back and forth and came up with the concept of the AV wanting to abandon it, the state stepping in and buying the branch to prevent it from getting abandoned, and then the Benton and Southern being appointed as the designated operator.
Yeah, that's really neat. And it keeps it your own. You're not just, copying off of him and saying it's the AV, right over here. It still becomes your own. I think that's probably very important.
It is. And the nice thing about it is being a short line, most short lines don't have a ton of rolling stock of their own. They might have some, but a lot of them don't have much. And so they the prototype short lines rely on the class 1 carriers and regionals to supply them with the cars they need. So that gives me an excuse to run a lot of AV cars on my railroad.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure, that being able to connect the two is super neat. What era is the Benton and Southern? And I'm sure it coordinates with the Arkansas Valley. So what era are you operating in?
Well, the AV is operating in the late 80s is what he does, but he's got some modern power and he's got some early Alcos. So he kind of does what he wants. I have two distinct eras. I have the mid to late 80s, and then I have a separate batch of equipment for 2005 to 2015 in that region, because I love the rust buckets that you see on the rails today, and you really didn't get that back in the 80s because most of the cars back then were still painted with lead-based paint. They didn't rust; they just got dirty. Yeah. So I like the conspicuity stripes, yep. If I could talk, and ditch lights. The modern railroad, what I see today, and so I don't have big power, but now I've got Jeep 38-3s and GP39Ms. GP39M is basically a GP30 that was rebuilt to GP39 standards, similar to the way the Burlington Northern did, and a couple of other railroads as well.
Excellent. And by the way, I can't say that word either. I've learned to call it FRA 224 stripes because I won't even try saying it. It's a tricky word for me. But that's great. And so let's talk about power and let's talk about paint schemes. So you've come up with this concept. You worked with your buddy Joe there, Arkansas Valley, and you've created the Benton and Southern, and now you got to come up with colors and something to do with your locomotive. So tell me about that process.
As far as the paint scheme, I credit a longtime mentor who was my general manager when I volunteered for the Willamette Shore Trolley tourist operation in the Portland area. His name was Rod Cox, and he always preached. He was a professional sign painter, and he instilled in me that red is an action color. Red and yellow are a great combination of action colors, and so they look good together, and so that's what I went with. I would have liked to do blue, but the AV was blue, so I needed to do something a little different. So I came up with the kind of a Santa Fe red with yellow lettering, a black roof, and silver trucks on most of the units, but sometimes I just leave them black because I'm too lazy to paint them. They may turn silver later on. I don't know.
That sounds like a prototype railroad thing too. Yeah, I've seen them. Yeah, why wasn't that painted? We didn't feel like it. We didn't have the time for it. So yeah, they all can fit into a story.
And I also have quite a few locomotives that are in, still in predecessor paint. For example, Paducah GP10s that Intermountain put out. They're the red and orange and white creamsicle paint scheme that IC and ICG had in the 70s. I've got a bunch of those locomotives, and they still run around in the orange and white with the Illinois Central lettering removed and renumbered for Benton and Southern, and BSR below the cab.
I guess that's kind of to me, kind of an appeal of freelance model railroading is that you can work in stuff, even stuff that may be outside your box. Like let's just say I was a class 1, I'll even narrow it down, say I'm going to model NS. And you got to kind of follow what NS is doing. But when you create your own freelance, you can do that. Like, hey, I like that scheme. I'm going to delete, the road name on it, but I'm going to make it my own and then just kind of add it to my story and, make it plausible. And that's a really cool thing. It kind of opens up your mind a little bit and allows you a little bit of flexibility, doesn't it?
It does. And you said the key word, plausible.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and put a BNSF SD70 Mac in line with GP10s and GP7s because that just, well, it could happen. It's not plausible, not probable.
Right.
So, I tried to stick with, okay, in the mid 2000s, in the 80s, what were the class 1s getting rid of? They were getting rid of GP7s. They were getting rid of GP9s. The Illinois Central was dumping Jeep 10s. Santa Fe was dumping the CF7s. So that's kind of where I say, okay, well, those are what we would have gotten for cheap because being a small short line, we don't have a giant bank account to buy new power.
Right.
And as I've gotten into the more modern era, that Jeep 7s and 9s are becoming Jeep 38-2s, the 39Ms. I've got a couple of SD40s that are being considered SD40 M-2s that Morrison Knudsen rebuilt in the 90s, that kind of thing.
You mentioned quite a few locomotive models there. Do you have a favorite?
My two favorite locomotives are the EMD SW1, because that's the first locomotive I ever got to run, and the Southern Pacific SD9s, the Cadillacs. They're got to be my favorite locomotive.
And you have those, of course, in Benton and Southern colors?
No. I've got an SW1.
Okay.
I've got an SW1 that is in the works. It's on the bench being readied for paint. As far as the SD9s, I have all 8 of the Walthers Proto ones that have come out over the last few years. I'm leaving them in SP paint because I just can't, what's the word I'm looking for, muster the energy and the thought of painting over it to me is sacrilege.
Isn't it funny how we feel about that with paint schemes and not wanting to see them go away, and as much as you want to put your own on there, yeah, it's like desecrating a flag at times, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'll have SP power run through or being borrowed or leased for during the 80s. That's how I'm going to justify it.
So let's talk track plan for the Benton and Southern and what you have for a layout and how that all developed. Tell us how you started to develop the plan to put this layout together.
The current layout is the, I don't know, 5th or 6th iteration within the house that I'm living in now. And I had my first Benton and Southern was a switching layout at my old apartment. It was 2 foot by 10 foot, and just a runaround siding and 3 spurs, and it wasn't much, but it worked. And when my wife and I bought the house 5 years ago, I claimed the 13 by 17 foot family room in the basement for my train room, and I started with a triple deck design. I was going to go whole hog.
I was going to say, go big or go home there with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I got it built. The track was up. I immediately realized it was not feasible. I had to crouch to see the lower level, and I had to stand on a step stool to see the top level.
Yeah, not convenient at all, huh?
Not convenient at all, especially for operations, because I wanted a railroad with operations, and I wanted a railroad that I had some running space between switching locations, and it worked. The Helix, my first attempt at a Helix, was pathetic at best. I'll be the first to admit it. It was more of a roller coaster with a little undulations, and it was not a smooth grade at all. I very quickly got frustrated with it. About 6 months in, I ripped out the top deck, ripped out the helixes, and raised the middle deck up to about chest level and kept the lower deck. We could put a little more space in between the decks. And I did a couple of variations with that where I would have a helix and then I would get frustrated with the helix again and I'd rip it out, and I was operating 2 separate decks. The top deck was just going to be a continuous around the room rail fan layout just to run long trains so I can run trains while I'm working. And then the bottom deck was going to be for switching. And that worked okay. The biggest downside was the door that goes into the room opens into the room. And for me to do that, to run, I had to close that door and put in the lift out section, which made it hard for me to hear my wife or if I needed to come up for upstairs for anything. Then about a year ago, I was to the point where I was just I go into the train room, I would literally look around, sigh in disgust, turn around, turn the light off, and walk back out. I was just not happy at all. And I wasn't doing anything. The room was cluttered because I've got too much stuff, which I'm sure a lot of us modelers have.
Many suffer from that, yes.
Yes. And I finally bit the bullet and I gutted the room. I took every piece of bench work down. My wife told me I was losing my mind, which I probably was a little bit, but every time I'd make changes to the layout, I would scab together and band-aid together and jerry-rig from the old to do what I wanted. And it got to be a problem. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to tear it apart. I'm going to start from the ground up. I'm going to do a brand new design and I'm going to build it right. And I spent a month or so designing track plans, took it to the hobby shop, reviewed it with my coworkers and my friends, and got to something where I was happy with it and came back, started building, and it's been loads of fun since.
What you just mentioned that you did is, to me, I'm finding as I have more and more conversations, and I even think myself, and we talk pre-show about some challenges that I have on my layout. And I think a lot of folks hit that point where they get fearful of just doing what you did, which is if you're not happy with the layout, it's time for it to go and time for it to be replaced with something else. And I think it's a hurdle to get over for many people. And I know personally it's a hurdle to get over to even if I have to take a section out, it's like this whole thought process of, oh my God. And then you realize the layout comes out easy. Right. I mean, there's not much to it. It's all up here in your head that you just got to get over that hurdle of saying, all right, I've put enough into this and I'm not getting what I need out of it. it's time for me to actually take that step and say, it's got to come down, and I got to put up something. And it may be a little bit of suffering of not having a layout for a little bit of time, but the end result is going to be something I'm going to enjoy a lot better. And it sounds like that's the point you hit. You finally hit that breaking point where you decided enough's enough.
Yeah, I was so disgusted. I was literally ready to rip out the railroad and sell off everything and just be done with the hobby.
Wow.
I was
you went real dark. Yeah.
I was kind of in a way dark, but it was just more of a frustration.
Yeah.
And my other hobby is photo slides of trains, and I collect them. I've got close to 200,000 slides.
Yeah.
And that takes up a lot of space, and it takes up a lot of time. And I only have so much time, and I have so much money to put towards my hobbies. And fighting over, I was thinking about just going and doing nothing but the slides. But after talking with Joe, because Joe's my best friend, we've talking about what we can do, what I could do instead. He says, just tear it out and redo it.
Yeah.
And that's the advice I ended up taking, and I'm thankful I did. I love the track plan now. It's a continuous run with 3 tracks of hidden staging, but it's operated like a point-to-point.
Okay, cool. Talk about the track plan. Talk about what your industries are on there, and kind of what the Benton and Southern does.
The layout has 5 or 6 industries on it, 2 of which are grain feed related. So covered hoppers, which is my favorite type of freight car. I've got an ADM ethanol plant, which was an inspiration from Tim Garland's Seaboard Central. I've been following his progress on his new layout, and I really liked the amount of operation he was able to do in such a small space. And so I'm trying to emulate that in my own space. I actually took out one of the industries that I had, cut the track back, and relayed everything to fit this ethanol plant. And I'm having a blast with that. So other industries, there is Evergreen Packaging, which makes fiberboard. And they make fiberboard, and they also make the cardboard, the wax coated cardboard that is used for like drink cartons.
Okay.
So the Benton and Southern Home Shops boxcars were purchased for that service. They're dedicated cars, and they ship out boxcars full of product, and they also take waste paper in. Ellis Corporation is a fertilizer blend plant. They receive covered hoppers of phosphate and tank cars of acid. Bell Paper is they receive boxcars full of paper, and they cut it down and for customer specs and ship it out by truck. The other major industry is Johnson County Co-op. Johnson County is the area that Clarksville is in Arkansas. And the co-op, they basically ship out a few carloads of feed here and there. They're more of a sporadic shipper.
As far as operations, what would you say is your favorite part of your layout, or what is your favorite industry?
Probably the newest one, the ethanol plant, is my current favorite, just because that's still new. I'm having an absolute blast with it. It's going to be a dedicated position. My room can handle 2 to 3 people as far as operators. Mm-hmm. So the one of those jobs will be the ethanol plant switcher, and then the other 1 or 2 will be local freights serving the other industries on the layout.
I think you've discovered a secret, or maybe not a secret, but an important point, that not all industries have to be served from a local, or even operating sessions don't have to be all locals, or you can put somebody in an industry and build an industry where there's a lot of switching at one, and leave them there. And I've seen other layouts and operate on layouts with similar circumstances that it just works out great. And then you don't have to worry about that person moving around or interfering with this or that they go right to that spot, and there's plenty of work for them to be done. So kudos to you for figuring that out. That's awesome.
And switch, I did a kind of a dry run operations on it here for the first time a couple days ago, and using the proto throttle helps slow things down to more prototypical speeds, and having to stop and allow time to throw the switches and operate more realistically, kind of like you just released the video with Lance Mindheim.
Well, that was it was a Lance Minheim video that he released. I shared the link on that, and that's all in the Lance Minheim video. Yeah, it's all on his YouTube channel. But yeah, definitely a great video that highlights that. But go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, it allows you to slow down, and it took me an hour and a half to switch the plant because there's only so many cars that fit over the unloading pit, and if you have 10 cars that need to unload, you got to spot 2. Then you got to pull out and go over to another track and spot another 2 and give those time to unload while you're doing something else. Then you go and pull those 2 and put 2 more in. And it takes time to go back and forth and do all of the tasks that plant switcher would do. So what I'll have, the way I'll operate it is I'll have a local that serves the rest of the industries on the layout. I'll have a dedicated local that comes down from Lone Pine Yard, which is staging, and it'll come down to the area where ADM is, and there's 2 other spurs that are associated with that in that little area of the layout, and that local will set the cars off for the plant, the covered hoppers. The Benton and Southern crews will switch the ethanol tank cars, but the plant switcher will handle the covered hoppers. And then there's the 2 other team track spurs that will be handled by the local as well. So there'll be 2 Benton and Southern locals. One handles the stuff around the rest of the room, and the other 2 that handle the ethanol cars and the 2 team tracks right there they're right there by the ethanol plant.
Well, that's awesome, and we'll definitely be looking to have pictures of that we can share. You'll find all of those, along with additional links and notes about today's show on our website, aroundthelayout.com. So we'll be able to, again, share some stuff out about the Benton and Southern. So what's your next big project for the Benton and Southern?
I'm going to start trying to get that area where the ethanol plant is scenic. I want to do a little more test ops before I button everything up track-wise, make sure it all works smoothly. Then I want to start scenery. That's my next real big step. And I'm working on creating more operations. I'm using prototype documents that, again, inspiration that I've gleaned from Tim Garland and a couple of other people. Yeah, that's
awesome. And then as far as test ops, are you doing it on your own, or have you had folks over to try it and run it too, or how are you handling that?
So far, just by myself. We had one op session on the original layout when we first moved, the triple deck layout, and it was a nightmare. I mean, it was all right, but I thought it was a nightmare because of the deck heights and all of that other issues. So I haven't had the guys over yet to come and break in the layout again. I still got some more track wiring to do to making sure everything runs smooth. So I'm trying to eliminate as many opportunities from gremlins to show up before I start having people over.
Layout owners always think it's worse than what it was. I found that, like, the apologetic layout owner who will be like, "Oh, I'm sorry." It's like, listen, this isn't a big deal. I'm having a blast, okay. So a locomotive stalling a little bit on a switch. You'll put a tack there and go fix it at some point, or you'll write a note. But yeah, no, that stuff doesn't really bother operators. We're just thrilled. And, any good operator is just thrilled to be able to go operate. And layout owners are always nervous as heck trying to make sure everything's perfect. And, you hear I ran that thing 3 times yesterday and never had that problem. Well, guess what? When you start putting more carbon dioxide in a room, that's exactly what starts to happen to these things. So I'm sure you're going to have some really great operations on your new Benton and Southern Railroad, and we'll definitely enjoy following along as you create more on your layout and add scenery, and we'll definitely get you back up on Around the Layout for more updates. So
I appreciate that. And yeah, and I'm trying to start shooting some more videos and put them on my YouTube page. There's only 3 on there now, but it'll grow. And then my Facebook page, I always posting stuff. So
hobbies within the hobby, that's for sure.
Yes.
That'd be great. We'll share the link to your YouTube channel all in those notes again, aroundthelayout.com. So until next time, Brian, it was awesome having you here on Around the Layout.
Ray, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.